All right, I'm Andy Barratt. Thanks to those who actually stayed. I think we had a mass out of this, which is a shame. I'll do a quick intro, who I am. I've removed my corporate bro jacket, so I'll try and keep this a little bit more friends and family. This is my corporate bio. I now run our financial services business at Coalfire. I have about 90 people split between the US and the UK. We're one of the largest assurance providers. I say our job is to help really large corporates keep the promises that they make to everybody. We do that with compliance programs, all certification work you can imagine. I'm somewhat affiliated with none of these people. I do quite a lot of public speaking. But I'm going to ditch the corporatiness and do the who am I really. So this is my shameless acquisition in our Manchester office, which Stuart's going to come and try fairly soon. I'm a bit of a coffee snob. A shameless traveller, a bit of a nerdy gamer, so prizes for anyone who forgets the games afterwards. Father of two great kids. And my team seemed to love taking the mickey out of me. So the last time I was over in LA, one of my team gave me a Andy as Princess Rainbow Sparkle, which became a gift for my daughter, and she thought it was hilarious. So I'm a bit of a solar nerd as well. I'm desperately trying to stay in shape, which is hard when you're traveling all over the world all the time. But today, I have the opportunity to tell a true story. And the reason this is really kind of bizarre is because of the article that you can scan here, and I suggest you do. So I'm not going to mention the names because I know we're going to record this, but this is a true story. There's a case that I worked on personally during the pandemic. I'm going to interweave another case that I'm not allowed to talk about because it isn't in the public, which covers some of the Fin7 attribution that Sarah beautifully teed me up for. So I'm going to do a little show of hands first. I want to kind of get an idea. How many people in the audience already work or would claim to work in information security, cybersecurity? Raise your hands. All right, fairly good. That helps a lot. All right, so terminology 101. All these terms are very specific to payment security fraud. So PFI is both a designation and a type of investigation. So I am a PFI. It means I'm a payment forensic investigator authorized by the credit card schemes, certified by the PCI Council, big compliance body. If you do anything with credit cards, you'll end up going through one of their audits at some point. POS is not what you're thinking. It's a point of sale. Actually, acquiring bank, those are the banks who take the credit card payments through the card brands, so people like Visa, MasterCard, JCB, Diners, Discover, etc. And then the issuing bank is the people who give you your credit card, and usually lines of credit. So they usually manage all the lines of credit, and they'll make sure that you get a card that you can use. Merchants, people you're going to spend money with. CPP is the really interesting one. So the CPP is what's called a common point of purchase. This is really important because this is how almost all credit card fraud detection gets done. And it's really clever because what happens is it works out based on where we as cardholders report fraud to our banks, where we all spent money recently. So imagine Andy and Stu, we've been out shopping, we've been a little bit crazy, and we notice a few strange transactions on our statement. We call our bank and go, honestly, I didn't spend $4,500 on a Vision Pro at Apple shop, please, it wasn't me. Then they say, okay, we'll take it off. And what happens is all those complaints get aggregated. And when it becomes apparent that there is a common point of purchase, a fraud alert is alarmed by one of the big payment brands in conjunction with the issuing banks, and then they kick off what's called payment forensic investigation. So this is the story of a payment forensic investigation that started in 2020 as the world was locking down. So those of you who've done forensics will know it's a very laborious task. Lots of hands-on systems, pulling drives, imaging. It appears the world was locking down everywhere except here. So, does anyone know where this is? Thank you, Texas. We had two substantial PFI cases that ran through Texas right in the middle of the pandemic. Pandemic doesn't apply in Texas, as you'll know if you speak to Texans during a pandemic. And so we had our traditional Forensic Friday. So anyone who works in forensics knows it's the law. You only get the request to come and do forensics and IR on a Friday, and it goes a bit like this. This is the salesperson who gets the call. This is the DFIR person. It's like, oh my God, Friday, I'll do an investigation. So that was me, as much as I'd like to be a Ghostbuster. I think I've probably grown out of that costume now. This is the reality of our world. So PFI can be triggered at almost any point. It's commercial, so it goes out to a group of people all accredited to do this work. And then we basically bid on the investigation work. And so we bid on this piece of work, and the salesperson said to me, "It's a small case." Small. I promise you, small is a relative term in Texas. So this case is a nightmare. From what started as a small case, from one franchise of a very popular fried chicken restaurant, we ended up taking on between 200 and 300 impacted franchises and having to do forensic investigations across them all. The terminology we use to describe these, I probably can't share in public because it's just terrible use of English, but also filled with terrible expletives. We have so many different types of point-of-sale software, so many different vendors in the loop, so many different IT companies in the loop. We literally were like trying to work out the permutations just so we could report them, let alone start the forensic investigation. So we had an awful lot of challenges in this case, not least of which was all these franchises had different ownership structures, and we were trying to figure out how to manage a forensic investigation across the lot with what appeared to be a fairly sophisticated adversary. I say sophisticated, but I think when I get to the next slide. So you can't see any of the phrases, I suspect, but detection was a nightmare. So we had loads of people who were either owner-operators, we had some that were professionally run organizations, we had some people who didn't know what a firewall was and proved it to us at the time. We had a lot of people who were just totally clueless and didn't believe it was a thing. It was kind of like the anti-vaxxer of forensics, again, fairly common in Texas. So the big challenge we had was, one, we had to prove to people that they had been compromised. We had tons of evidence to prove it from the banks. We had all of this common point of purchase data saying like all of these franchises appear to be compromised. And still a lot of people saying like, we don't want to do this. It's expensive. I don't have to shut my business for a period of time. Detecting the issue was a real nightmare. And we had to run this case during the middle of a pandemic, under travel restrictions. I was the lead investigator and I wasn't in Texas. And so we managed to scale the case. And one of the things I wanted to share with this group today is some of the things we did during what was a fairly complicated case to make it work and to be successful within some reasonable bounds. So we had some scaling challenges which we addressed. We adopted some very new technology for both forensics and data acquisition very early in this process. Otherwise, we would have never been able to do it. We actually, at one point, had people out on the road all over North America because it wasn't actually just isolated to Texas, fortunately. And we had people doing, we call them the tender forensic guys, because everywhere they would go, the franchise owner, once they'd imaged the back office machine, would offer them a big portion of chicken tenders. They were very proud of that chicken. But detecting these problems was a nightmare, and this was our next kind of challenge. So we have capture, anyone who's forensics. First thing we've got to do is capture all our evidence. And our lab is in South Denver, Colorado. So we had to get evidence to Colorado so that they could get it investigated right. This in itself doesn't sound like too hard of a job when you're doing one or two restaurants. But when you do 300 and nobody can tell you where they all are, nobody can give you actual addresses or locations, this is a nightmare. There's also a real scaling problem. So I had a whole bunch of really strange conversations. The process with PFI is immensely stakeholder driven. So every week, typically into an investigation, you have to brief all stakeholders. And I imagine there's 200 to 300 franchisees potentially in this kind of case, all of which accept payments using different banks. I would have to get on conference calls where we did roll call through almost every bank you can imagine in the world who'd send an attendee who was material to the investigation. And so that would take about 20 minutes just to get through the like, hi, is that Chase Manhattan? Yes, is it JCB? Like, yeah, we've got everybody. Now we can talk about the three things we figured out during this case. What was happening was we couldn't keep up with the volume that we had. And so we had to pivot really, really quickly. But we were under tons and tons of pressure. There was an awful lot of fraud being committed. And again, it was just a function of scale. Like we had lots and lots of restaurants that we believed had been targeted by a group that was modeled around the Fin7 TTPs. So we had a reasonable idea of the tactics they were using. They were only interested in payment card data, specifically in North America track data. That track data can be used to clone cards and then used to be spent in other countries and quickly cashed out. So for those of you who were working out which sins you were guilty of in the last session, these guys are definitely guilty of following the money. So our challenge was getting all of this data to our like analysis hub in Colorado and trying to figure out how we can get through everything, find evidence of compromise. Our job was really to try and get the root cause established and then get all of these franchisees to contain. And the containment was a nightmare. I'll talk about that in a second. So we had to scale, and we had to scale really, really fast. We adopted some really interesting technology that Amazon just released at the time for data center migrations. I think it was called Snowdrop, and essentially it's like a mobile NAS. And the best way to describe this is you put your NAS wherever you want to do, copy all the data onto it, and then you put it in a mailbox. And it ends up in your S3 bucket. How it does that, I have no idea. But it worked, and we would get notifications, and we could suddenly scale in parallel. And so I could send forensic investigators out all over North America with a Snowdrop device, a bunch of hard drives and write blockers, and we could image entire networks of food restaurants, for want of a better expression, and quickly get them to our lab. And we would then have time tracking. We could manage expectations with all these crazy stakeholders. I could tell them, we will have the next phase of analysis kicking off in the next couple of days, because we would have tracking information from Amazon. We would know how much had been consumed in our current storage system, and we were ready to kind of get containment discussion started with all of these franchises that didn't know what firewalls were, couldn't tell us who their IT people were. In some cases, it was their friends and family. In other cases, fun one was we met a franchisee who'd been given their franchise by an oil millionaire as a thank you for doing their taxes. Honestly, I thought I'd seen everything, and then that one cropped up. I definitely haven't. So getting to containment was just super challenging. The first thing we have to report back to the big payment brands is the crime has stopped. That's the simple way to think of it. Containment can mean different things when you're doing an investigation. Their view is, has the bad guys stopped getting data out, and is fraud likely to be stopping soon? The challenge with that is that once all that data has been consumed, there is almost endless card fraud taking place until the issuers know all of the cards that have been stolen. The challenge is we had so little data. We had no corporate infrastructure. So if you imagine you're doing incident response in a traditional corporate environment, you'll probably have tooling, you'll have detection technologies, you can do remote acquisition, you might be able to use things that you can scale quickly because you own the network. We're a third party going into 300 different networks set up 300 different ways by people, some cases who don't even understand basic IP address schema, let alone how to use things like a firewall for good. So containing them, we literally had containment plans that started with install firewall, stop bad stuff. There were AT&T connections that were just plugged straight in to a point of sale system that we could have logged on with a remote desktop session over the internet. It was really scary. So containment was hard. We eventually got to a point where we felt we could contain the people who were willing to do the containment actions. Because this case was so big, we had to kind of keep the progress moving, because the fraud that was taking place was immense. And then the thing that nobody ever talks to you about, so when all of this is going on, the people who are being defrauded are racking up a bill that they're not aware of. So those cards that have been compromised have to be reissued to us. So as cardholders, there is a reissuance cost. And in a previous piece of work I did, I was actually an expert witness to MasterCard, and I actually got to see the price breaks involved in a large data compromise. And it's the most heinous pricing schedule you can imagine. It's your first 100,000 credit cards will replace at $10 a card. Because you had 2 million stolen, they're now $6 a card. And it's the most awful set of price breaks that you can ever imagine. When you're in the millions, this kind of scales just beyond most people's comparison. And then the next challenge is you're also on the hook for the fraud. So we had to get this done, and we had to get it done really quickly, and we had a lot of people who didn't want to cooperate. And so this is what our stakeholder meetings found like. I had Visa, MasterCard, all these big card brands going are we done yet? Are we done yet? Are we done yet? I'm I need a simple explanation. So I genuinely used the Twinkie moment from Ghostbusters, where I had to sit down. I had about 50 or 60 global banks, representation from every card brand, and I said, we have 2 petabytes of data, roughly, from 300 franchises with about 8 to 10 lanes per restaurant. Each of them's got a crappy 300 to 500 gig SATA drive. These things take time. The literal time it takes to get from disk to lab is X. And they went, that's a really good explanation. Nobody's ever told us that before. Which my mind blew a little bit. And so they went, okay, just give us an update. And they start to use our terminology. So they say, is it in processing now? Which was the language we would use to say it's hit the lab. we'd say it's been processed, we have a big tool that indexes all the data, and we can do analysis with reasonably quickly. And when they started to do that, we knew we'd won. So we were getting further and further into this case, and there was just so much malware. Like, one of the team, who I won't name, basically coined the phrase, it's like we fried them in malware. It's that bad. We had several locations where we couldn't ascertain the original point of compromise. It was even potentially compromised on installation with multiple different threat actors. And at one point, we saw so many different tools. We were like, this looks like it's a pen test rig. So it was that bad. I mean, so some examples. So we had malware masquerading as the point of sale. So it would just look like it was the point of sale software, and they would launch it. And then what it would do is spin up an image that looks like the counter. So people would smack the screen on the point of sale. Nothing would happen. They'd run the card, and then it would just steal all the track information. We saw tons of stock offensive tech. So, I mean, this was like Kali 101. You see things like Mimikatz everywhere. There's password dumping tools. Just shameless. Absolutely shameless. There was no attempt to hide it. We found like folders. It was like day one, day two. They're just dumping out big text files of track data. It was awful. Rogue help files. That's quite a funny one. That was actually one of the TTPs we realized was aligned with, I think, Fin7 at the time. There's no firewalls. I'm literally not joking. This is therapy for me now. So many places didn't have a firewall. It was almost embarrassing. But the evidence of multiple intrusions was the thing that was really scary. It was almost like there was multiple groups just toying with it because they could. Like, there was so much access to these systems, it was painful. So what did we do? We ended up having to review all this stuff. And then the funniest thing I think happened was when one of the team called me and said, Andy, I think I made a mistake. And I'm like, how do we make a mistake? We've systemized everything we do now. And he said, I've got a BurgerFi point of sale. I'm like, you went to the chicken place though, right? Like, the color schemes are different. And it turns out that this franchise just bought a BurgerFi point of sale, plugged it in and installed their card reader. And so they had a BurgerFi point of sale in a fried chicken restaurant. Our confusion was insane. So we did have some cool moments though. So I wanted to share this because, again, I didn't go to Texas whilst we ran this case. I'm fortunate I had some great staff on my team who were able to support the investigation. But I was the throat to choke. I ended up doing all the communications. And I remember one night, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning, I had this briefing with the Secret Service and the FBI. And this was really, really cool because we get to speak to the Secret Service occasionally. They're the owners of credit, essentially the US dollar. And so that's not unusual. And if you ever get to see their presentations, their field agents are all over the world. They're really good people generally. But I had this really fun moment where my kids are in bed. I'm speaking probably quite loudly on the phone. And my son comes into my office and he wanders in. And I'm on the phone to the Secret Service and the FBI. I just look at my son and he looks at me and he's like, why are you not in bed, Dad? And he says, what am I doing? I'm on the phone to the FBI. And he goes, FBI. It's like, cool. So that's a win. Like, we don't get to choose what's cool, but your kids do. So the other thing that was really important was I had to think globally by default. And I think the takeaway I've seen a lot in the UK is that there's a lot of like weird sentiment in the UK economy. Depending on which news channel you watch, I think there's also a lot of strange stuff. You hear people talking about boot camps, there's experiences, all this stuff. Like, I would say forget about all that. We operate in an industry that has to act and execute globally. And the UK has a very prominent position in the world. We can engage well with the US. We provide really good time zone differences. We're English speaking typically. But we also have access to other parts of the world where we have different diplomatic relations than the US does. And so we have this unusual position where we can actually just act as a global support mechanism in some cases. And so I always encourage people, if you're thinking about a career in cyber, don't just think about UK. Think about everything. Think about the whole world, because there's a ton of opportunity if you just don't think about the one thing that's right in front of you. So that's kind of my TLDR. I know I've got a couple of minutes. I can take questions on this case. If anybody's interested, you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I can go through some of the specifics. One of the crazy pieces that happened was having to be interviewed by Brian Krebs on behalf of the owners of the fried chicken place. The owner had no idea, and his lawyer basically pulled me onto the call and said, they can do 3 things: frying chips, frying fish, frying chicken, and running a franchise. So we have nothing else that we do. That was literally this guy's expertise. He'd inherited this whole business, And I remember being on a call with Brian, and I've spoken to Brian Krebs a couple of times. He's a really nice guy, but he gets to the point really quickly. And so what we managed to do was give him enough of the story that we could placate his desire to write a case. And then I actually gave him a whole bunch of intelligence from some other cases we were working on just to take the heat off our current investigation, because an intelligence firm was continually leaking this into the media. And at one point we were like, we're not sure now who has the most current set of information. Is it the people leaking the intel, or is it us working the case? But if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about it, happy to talk through some of the details. If you're interested in working forensics, incident response, cybersecurity, come and talk to me. If you want to work in compliance, GRC, again, happy to talk. I mentor quite a few people through both Caps Lock and UA92 in Manchester. So if you need some support, give me a shout. I'll give you back to Stuart.
Awesome.